Okay, guys, Chapter 20, Collapse at the Center, World War, Depression, and the Rebalancing of Global Power, 1914 to the 1970s. This is Section 1, the First World War, European Civilization in Crisis. I'm going to go ahead and start over with this section just because it was interrupted and it's so important for this last century that we're going to study. So I'm going to go ahead and start over. Except for the visual source analysis, we don't have to do that. Okay, like I said earlier in class today, the division of history into different segments is necessary, although sometimes those divisions are artificial and controversial. And the problem is especially pronounced with the 20th century. It's one of the major problems. The basic question is, what does the 20th century represent? Or does the 20th century represent a phase of world history? And given the 20th century, the separate status that has become the norm in world history textbooks. So it's kind of seen as a separate phase, its own phase. But it's unclear that future generations will view it in the same way. 100 years is an awfully short time in world historical terms. And at the same time, we're suffering from information overload, which makes it hard to distinguish, the forest from the trees. So we don't know if and when this period will end. Now, the 20th century contains both old and new information. The 20th century, it's marked by continuities and changes. The world wars grew out of European inability to create a single state. The communist revolutions are also blended, the old and the new. And the 20th century is also distinguished by the disintegration of great empires and the creation of new nation states. And so a new turn happens against the old idea of empire. And by 2000, more than 200 nation states exist globally. And the century's most fundamental process was explosive population growth. The human population nearly quadrupled between 1900 and 2000, and the Earth's population is now nearly 7 billion. Or is it? Did we reach 7 billion? I think we did. And the industrial output increased 40-fold during the 20th century, that's just astronomical. That kind of growth. And such growth is new, but it's also built on earlier foundations of the scientific and industrial revolutions, and it's spread beyond the West to most of the known world. And the human impact on the environment isn't new, it's just grown. And globalization also has deep roots in the past. And we've already studied that and talked about it, especially with not just the expansion of empires, but in terms of economic systems and trade routes. And Part 6 explores the global themes that shaped 20th century history. Chapters 20, 21, and 22 tell a separate story of these three major regions: the Western world, the communist world, the Third World. And the histories of the Third Worlds frequently intersect and overlap each other, and they're all part of a larger story, or globalization, which is Chapter 23. And only the future will reveal how the 20th century will be regarded by later generations. So, teaching history in the 20th century about the 20th century is difficult. The narrative paths diverge into a vast array of different global experiences. And so we'll focus on World War I in this section, but we don't spend too much time dealing with the specifics of individual battles or grand strategy. Instead, the emphasis is on a broader global aspect of the war and its role in places outside of Europe. Okay, the last veterans of World War I have died, and World War I was a massive disappointment because it wasn't the war to end all wars. But now the major European states have ended centuries of hostility, which were all leading up to World War I. And the Great War, which is what World War I is known as, of 1914 and 1918, launched a completely new phase of world history. as most historians believe. Between 1914 and the end of World War II, Western Europe basically just self-destructed. But Europe recovered surprisingly well in the last half of the 20th century. But they did it without its overseas empires, as new nations and independence formed and were gained, and without its position as the core of Western civilization, because as we discussed in class today, that core of Western civilization shifted even further west into the Americas. And by 1900, Europeans or people of European ancestry controlled most other peoples around the world, and we'll see that changes as the century continues on. Okay, modernization and Europe's rise to global power triggered those really sharpened those traditional rivalries between the European states. Both Italy and Germany unified around 1870. And by 1900, the balance of power in Europe was shaped by two rival alliances, really set forth by Otto von Bismarck, guy that used the policy of realpolitik to basically what he was doing when he unified Germany was setting these alliances, or his alliance with Austria and Italy, to deter war, but that's actually not what happened. So Germany, Austria, and Italy are what's known as the Triple Alliance, and the Triple Entente is Russia, France, and Britain. And this is really bad for Germany because they now have France and Russia who are allies on both sides of Germany and France. And they're in the middle. And these alliances are what turned a minor incident, that assassination, into a world war. And that was June 28th, 1914, a Serbian nationalist assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand. His name was Gavrilo Princip. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and many Serb nationalists and even separate groups like the Black Hand really promoted war between Austria-Hungary and Serbia in order for Serbia to gain independence. But Austria was determined to crush this nationalist independence movement. And Serbia had Russia and Russia's allies supporting it and behind it. And thus general war broke out in August of 1914. And we looked at this map today, but this shows you a really good idea of where different colonies and dominions are and essentially what brought this into a world war. You can see basically all of Africa, India, and good parts of Southeast Asia are European colonies. The British have dominions in darn near every time zone. Australia, South Africa, Egypt, and at one point with the Suez Canal, and of course Canada as dominions. And then you can see the different parts of Europe up here, where some countries are the map is very different now than what it used to be. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about this accident waiting to happen. The factors that contributed to the outbreak and character of World War I: popular nationalism, industrialized militarism, Europe's colonial empires or imperialism, and that entanglement of alliances that we talked about. Okay, let's look at the legacies of the Great War. Most Europeans expected World War I to be a quick war. Believe it or not, there were propaganda statements. I believe it was the German Kaiser Wilhelm II, I think it was him, told all of his people, hey, soldiers, you'll be home, it's August, okay? You'll be home before the leaves begin to fall on the trees. Even the British and the French were very optimistic about World War I. They believed that it was going to be a quick war, going to go and lay down the law and come home. But it was 4 long, nasty, grueling years of war. Germany was finally defeated in November of 1918 as it became a war of attrition or trench warfare. And I explained to you how the trench warfare worked. And it was surprising and just horrific. The war shocked almost everyone, as they expected it to be a short war that would be over in a few months. But the industrial technology did not make it a quick war, but rather a war of attrition, like I said, trying to bleed each other dry in trench warfare. And the war saw a steady introduction of new and more brutal ways to kill, tanks, machine guns, gas. And because of this, battles could take the lives of over 1 million men. And with that labor shortage, large numbers of women were brought into the workforce on the home front. And there's a lot of widespread disillusionment in Europe as World War I became a total war, as each country's population was mobilized in one way or another, really expanded the authority of the government in each of these countries. Propaganda campaigns were sent to arouse the entire population, all of their citizens. Women replaced men, specifically in factories, and labor unions even had to accept sacrifices. The horrors of the war led many to question European values and the legacy of the Enlightenment. Some even began to reject the ideas of the West and Western civilization. And it's almost like a Mother's Day versus the flappers, right? The conservative forces tried to undo the cultural changes of the war. British authorities urged women to leave their new jobs, and in France, conservatives pushed Mother's Day as a celebration of women who had, these little boys in the army. And the war induced major changes in women's lives, with the nations giving them the vote and new work opportunities. And the post-war era was also the Jazz Age, which liberated women dressing like flappers and drinking and dancing in nightclubs and speakeasies, and in sharp contrast to the earlier conventions of a bourgeoisie respectability. And war left disillusionment among intellectuals. It is not just amongst the masses. It left widespread disillusionment in its wake. It led to, like I said, the questioning of the Enlightenment, the superiority of the West and science, and the social change, like I was just talking about. The enormous casualties, millions of men, because of the new ways to kill, really promoted social mobility. As women, like I said, won the right to vote, they flouted those sexual conventions and the flappers and the drinking and dancing and speakeasies. A new consumerism emerged. And radio and movies are really what became the vehicles for popular culture, and really what drove advertisement and how to get information to people and the masses. And there's also the rearrangement of the map of Central Europe as one of the legacies of the Great War. It created an independent Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. Poland was removed from German lands, Czechoslovakia from Austria-Hungary, as well as Yugoslavia. And it also created new problems of ethnic minorities, especially in Yugoslavia, where there were several minorities grouped together. And it also triggered the Russian Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. So the Russians are off at World War I, and in the midst of that go through a complete economic and political revolution in 1917. The Treaty of, before we get to the treaty, the end of the war, let's look at the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente that I was telling you guys about. So we have the Triple Alliance here with Germany and Austria-Hungary and Italy. and of course the Italian colony of Libya. And then you have the Triple Entente with Great Britain, France, and Russia, and then the French colonies in Africa, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. This shows not just the alliances between the two different camps, but specifically what I was talking about with the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians right here in the middle on the opposite sides of the two allies. So they would have been fighting two fronts to the war. And here's Serbia, right, which initially was part of the Austro-Hungarian throne. And here in Sarajevo is where Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. Okay. Love this map because it shows who lost what and how that was all organized. We have, in yellow, the Austro-Hungarian Empire lost all of this. Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Yugoslavia. Hungary became its own country separate from Austria. Okay, Poland, well, I take that back. Here's the little part that the Germans lost. And then this is what Russia lost. Russia had to exit the war because of their revolution. And so this is where they see the independent state of Poland that was created, and then the Baltic states, specifically Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And then, of course, the portion of Finland that the Russians lost. Okay, British mandates over here in orange, the French mandates here in purple. And this is what became known as the demilitarized zone in Germany, where Germany could not have any military stationed anywhere near here in this demilitarized zone, that where a significant portion of the Western Front was fought. And then, of course, you can see in the purple, all cap letters and underlined, are the creation of all of these new independent states. Right, with the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire. See Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, Jordan or Transjordan, and then over here is Kuwait. That was from Great Britain. But you can see a significant portion of the Ottoman Empire is changed or was changed. Right, in addition to the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire into multiple nation states as well. Okay, continuing on with the legacies of the Great War, the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 created the conditions that essentially caused World War II. Germany lost its colonial empire. In addition to that, territory in Europe was required to pay heavy war reparations, suffered restriction of its military forces, like I told you about, that demilitarized zone, and had to accept sole responsibility for the outbreak of the war. And the Germans really resented this treaty. Essentially, Germany was blamed for the war, and they were forced to pay that massive sum in those reparations. And this, in addition to accepting responsibility, really fostered great resentment within Germany and ultimately directly led to the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. Meanwhile, with the Great Depression in between that. Rough first half and start to the 20th century, worldwide. Like I said, the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire when we were looking at the map, the Armenian genocide, the creation of those new Arab states, Syria, Iraq, Transjordan, and also the British promises to both Arabs and Jews that created the problem in Palestine. The Young Turk nationalist government had long been suspicious of the Armenians, and fearing that they might work with the Russians, they launched this campaign of deportations and murder against about 1 million Armenians, as the war saw uprisings from various Arab groups. Essentially, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. But the new Turkish Republic, with its young Turk leaders, emerged from the ruins of the empire into what became a very secular yet Islamic state. And many of the colonies, the European colonies, were stunned by the slaughter in Europe. And in order to get support for the war, for example, the French and the British made promises for reforms and paths towards independence. But those promises were not kept, leading to that problem in Palestine. In Africa and Asia, many gained military skills and political awareness of what was going on, and also gained diplomatic skills. Britain promised to start the process of creating a self-government in India in return for helping in the war. Japan was strengthened by the war, as Japan's assumption of German privileges and territory in China really inspired some Chinese to adopt Soviet-style communism. And the Japanese expansionists used the war to move into German territory in China and placed a series of demands on China. And then the unwillingness of the Allies to check Japan and keep them in check turned many Chinese nationalists towards that Soviet-style communism. And the only power that spoke out against imperialism. So it's rather strange how things kind of turned out. And then we see the rise of the United States as a global power. U.S. manpower had been essential in the defeat of Germany. The United States became Europe's creditor, and this really upset. Let me get through this. And Europeans were fascinated by Woodrow Wilson's ideas and the League of Nations, even though the League of Nations didn't work. They're just in awe of his ideas. And with the devastation in Europe and the American industrial expansion is what really catapulted the United States into a new powerful player on the world stage. And Woodrow Wilson's optimistic efforts to create a new and just world order is what really raised America's diplomatic profile, or the United States' diplomatic profile. The U.S. becoming Europe's creditor, after it was all said and done, what the United States did was they lent Germany the money to repay Britain and France, which essentially is brilliant for the United States to do, because that's, what does that do? That then in turn flows money through and keeps the cycle of, money flow going throughout the world. Because if Germany wouldn't have been able to pay their war reparations, that could have sent things into spiraling downward and plummet to, globally much worse. So, a great idea for the United States, even though Britain and France didn't like it. But you know what? You gotta get paid, right? And that finishes section 1 about the First World War, and we will discuss the Great Depression tomorrow.